Hey everyone, just real quick, I wanted to interject. The original plan for this series was I was going to discuss how we got to the Constitution, Federalists versus Anti-Federalists, maybe discuss the Constitutional Convention a little, and then just have like maybe a five episode series thing. After doing some thinking, I've opted to rewrite it, so it was the first episode which was like the pre-constitutions. Then today we're going to be discussing about the Constitutional Convention, and the Constitutional Convention is going to carry us for quite a while because I want to discuss individual issues that were in the Constitutional Convention, and because there were a lot of issues, um, we this episode is going to focus solely on the Virginia Plan and the New Jersey Plan. We aren't even going to get into the Connecticut Compromise until next episode. So just real quick, want to let you guys know that. The Articles of Confederation were built on the groundwork of nearly 20 years of planning a central colonial government. From Franklin's Albany Plan to the Articles themselves, the government's goal was to create a set of strong, independent colonies, but when the time came for war or international treaties, they would be united. However, the Articles even failed at this, with most countries struggling to write treaties with them. However, it did succeed in uniting the country during the Revolutionary War somewhat. Once the Treaty of Paris was signed ending the Revolutionary War, cracks were obvious to most. A few rebellions even occurred in the newly created Americas, which were often not put down by the federal government, but rather by the state militia or by George Washington physically going there and talking to the rebels. By the mid-1780s, the elephant in the room had grown too large. The Articles of Confederation were a failure, and a new plan had to happen. Thus, in 1787, a meeting was called that would form our great government, known as the Constitutional Convention.
It's William Howard Taft.
James Madison had been a figure who had been quite strongly opposed to the Articles of Confederation basically since they were first created. And by 1787, most people had already seen the flaws that the articles had. And with a private endorsement from George Washington, James Madison would help set up the Constitutional Convention. And James Madison would be one of the first delegates to show up, showing up a few weeks before the first attempted quorum, because when a good portion of the delegates had first shown up in Philadelphia, they actually failed to make quorum, and they would reconvene just a bit later in about the late May. Originally, there was estimated to be about 70 delegates that they thought would be coming from all the different states. However, that number would drop down to 55, and that 55 includes the fact that Rhode Island never sent any delegates at all ever. Of the 55-ish, all delegates would somewhat be present at the start, except New Hampshire, who would end up showing up in late July. The delegates met in what is now known as Independence Hall, and famously the windows were nailed shut in the summer months of Pennsylvania, so all the delegates could talk freely because they were basically planning on usurping the current form of government, and there was a lot of discussions that had to take place, how the government should function, the different branches. Basically, to the outside world, the Constitutional Convention was supposed to be a meeting to kind of patch up the Articles of Confederation, but in reality, by the time the guys had already gotten there, it was essentially we're replacing the Articles of Convention. So everything had to be discussed. And when the meeting was first called into order after they made their first quorum, the delegates unanimously voted to make General George Washington the presiding officer of the meeting. And he would select one James McHenry to be his personal secretary. And William Jackson would be selected to be the official secretary of the meeting as a whole, actually beating out a William Franklin, aka Benjamin Franklin's grandson, aka the secretary who's most in charge of the Treaty of Paris.
It's William Howard Taft.
After electing the presiding officer and the secretary, the group voted on the rules of said meeting. One key rule that was created was that each state would have a single vote rather than each delegate. This would force the state delegates to discuss the ideas between themselves and be more unified on an idea in order to put it up for a vote generally. If a state's delegates were in a tie, however, that state would not cast a vote during that round of voting or whatever. And while there were a total of roughly 55 delegates, rarely were all of them present except the starting days and the end days. Most accounts that we have were roughly 30 to 40 delegates per day, and different days with different delegates with different states would have different rules for quorum. We know that New York, for example, required all three of their delegates present to vote. This would become a very serious problem for her as two of her delegates, John Lansing Jr. and Robert Yates, would leave the convention July 10th and stated that they will not be returning. So, any and all proposals after July 10th, New York was incapable of voting on them. The remaining New York delegate was actually Alexander Hamilton, who would still speak and give his opinions during the debates. But he really was there more for the fun of it as he couldn't vote. Another rule was that delegates could demand a revote on any previously voted upon decision, uh, which often led to delegates taking straw votes, which would give general idea of supports of items and let them work it out and change their minds. Another rule that was important is that for the discussions and the votes, all of those would be kept secret until the meetings were done. William Jackson would actually keep incredibly sparse records, and anything that wasn't an official vote, he would destroy. This would leave James Madison, who had a diary on the whole convention, as the best kept records of the convention that we know of.
It's William Howard Taft.
Now that the backdrop is set up with the rules and whatnot, we can begin discussing the first major point that was discussed in the convention, and this was roughly done during the first 2 months. And this was mostly focused on the Virginia Plan, also known as the Randolph Plan, also known as the Large State Plan. This plan was drafted up by James Madison before the convention even started, as he would be waiting in Pennsylvania, just waiting for the first quorum to be called. And this plan called for a strong central government that could actually solve the nation's problems. And this plan would be essentially the foundation of the ideas that would go on and become the Federalists. The Virginia plan called for Congress to have the ability to raise taxes, use force against non-compliant states, and the creation of a national court. Madison also believed that because this new Congress would rule the citizens rather than the states, that each state should have a number of delegates based on the state's population size, which should sound very familiar to you. Madison, like many of the founding fathers, was very wary of the tyranny of the majority. And in his belief that strong interest groups could gain control over a state, they would struggle to gain control over the nation. So he also believed that Congress should have the power to veto any specific state laws that was against the Constitution and against what Congress wanted. And while Madison is credited, and he definitely did create the plan, it would be Edmund Randolph, who would be at the time Virginia's governor, who would formally introduce it into the convention. That's why it's also known as the Randolph Plan. The Virginia Plan did call for the three branches of governments we know of today. However, one massive difference between the Virginia Plan and the eventual outcome of the entire Constitutional Convention was the lack of checks and balances that would become a very core feature of American republicanism. The Virginia Plan had 15 points and it was shown off in like a 15 point, not a slideshow, but if he had a slideshow, it would have been a slideshow uh, when it was brought to the convention. The first point was that this was straight up replacing the Articles of Confederation. The second point is that representation in the House was either by the wealth of the state or by the non slave population. Third was that there would be two houses of Congress. Fourth was that branch one of the two houses of Congress would be elected by the people. They could be recalled, and if they wanted to, they could be term limited. Point number five was that branch two of the House would be nominated by the state legislative. This should make sense as eventually branch one would become the House of Representatives elected by the people, and branch two would become the Senate elected by the state legislative. So we can see that survived. Number six was that all powers that belonged to the Confederation Congress would be placed in the new Congress, including the new ability to veto state laws. Number seven is that a national executive, aka a president, would be elected by the two houses, and he would have the powers of making war, making treaties, and he would have the authority to execute the national laws through force. Number eight, the president, along with a unknown amount of judges, they never specified a number, could veto any law made either nationally at the Congress or at a state, any state law. And that veto could be vetoed with a, once again, never clarified or stated, a unknown amount of votes from the national legislative. Number nine, this would be the creation of a national judiciary branch that dealt with federal issues, anything that was like cross state lines or piracy, that type of thing, or interstate issues. Number 10, there would be a way to introduce and make new states into the Union. Number 11, each state must have a Republican government. So this would make sure that, there's no King of New York or anything like that. Number 12, the current Congress that was from the Articles of Confederation would continue its work until an official replacement date happens. Number 13, the process to amend the Constitution would not require the national legislative. It wouldn't require Congress to do so. They didn't specify what the process would be at the time, but it didn't need Congress. And number 14 would be that state officers would take an oath to support the Constitution. And number 15 was that the proposals of this new Constitution will be ratified by the state assemblies that were elected by the people, rather than using any other format to ratify this Constitution. Of course, when this was proposed, the larger states loved it. New York, Pennsylvania, and especially Virginia would be very strong supporters of this plan, mostly because they had massive populations in comparison to others, and they would hold a vast amount of control in the country. Many of the smaller states, New Jersey, Rhode Island, all the baby states, really did not like this plan, mostly because they assumed, and probably correctly so, that at a federal level they would be completely ignored, and thus they provided a counteroffer, which would be known as the New Jersey Plan.
It's William Howard Taft.
And now we're going to be discussing the New Jersey Plan, the Small State Plan, or the Patterson Plan. And this was the alternative plan introduced at the convention. This plan proposed that each state would keep the one vote that was currently implemented, and the New Jersey plan would offer a 9-point plan to fix the articles. Keyword fix the articles, because point one was that the Articles of Confederation should be amended, not replaced. Point two was that Congress could raise funds via tariffs and other measures and had the right to regulate interstate commerce, and state courts would handle issues regarding this unless it was appealed to a federal level. Point three was that Congress can collect taxes from the states based on freeman and 3/5 of the slave population. However, this power needed the states' consent, and it was kind of weird how they worded it. Point four was that Congress will elect a federal executive consisting of multiple people who couldn't be reelected and was allowed to be recalled by Congress if a majority of the state's executives wanted it. So, yeah, basically, Congress picked multiple people to act as president, we'll say, and if a majority of state governors wanted those presidents recalled, Congress could recall them. Point five was that a federal judiciary is created, and it would handle impeachment and was an option for appeals from the lower courts. Point six was that the Articles was the law of the land, and the federal government may authorize force to force compliance. Number seven was that new states, there should be a policy to allow new states. Number eight was that there should be a single policy for naturalization. And point number nine was that a citizen of one state can be prosecuted under the laws of another state in which the crime was committed. The New Jersey plan was basically a put together real quick plan in order to counter the Virginia plan, and it was introduced June 15th, 1787, and was rejected on June 19th, 1787. Most people agree that the plan did not tackle enough of the core issues of the Articles to have been taken very seriously. Not to mention all the bigger states obviously strongly prefer the Virginia plan. Even a couple writers of the New Jersey plan voted against it. However, it did do its job in the sense that it showed the larger states that the smaller states would not be interested in the Virginia plan. And that is why we would eventually land on the Connecticut Compromise, which we will actually be discussing next video because this video is going on a little too long. And I think it's important that the Connecticut Compromise gets its own whole video dedicated to it because there's a lot there. Anyway, guys, thank you so much for watching this video. I'm sorry for the delay. I was a little sick, and then I'll be honest, didn't feel like making the video, but hopefully I'll be able to get these out a bit quicker, and it should look nicer too. And if you like the video, please like and subscribe. Maybe share it with, I don't know, someone who likes the Constitution and likes history. And like I said, next video, definitely Connecticut Compromise. And then we'll probably go back and kind of discuss each individual issue as it evolved over the course of the Constitutional Convention. So, have a wonderful one. This has
Get
been
on a
William
raft with
Taftstan.
Taft,
Thank you.
boys, get on the winning boat. The man worthwhile with a friendly smile will get the honest boat. He'll save the country sure, boys from Bryanhurst and Graft. So all join in, we're sure to win. Get on a raft with Taft.